Imagine you're invited to spend the night in a real medieval castle. Romance, adventure, a touch of mystery, just like in the movies. You step through towering stone gates, inhale the scent of history, and suddenly, cold, damp air, the musty stink of rotting straw, smoke, and, pardon the detail, human waste. The ceilings are low, the windows tiny, and the only echo down the halls isn't laughter from a feast, but someone slipping on the stairs for the third time today. This isn't Hogwarts. It's 1285. And castle life? It's not a privilege. It's a daily struggle with cold dirt, moody overlords, and the occasional visit from the Black Death. Welcome to the real Middle Ages. This episode isn't about legends or love stories. It's an autopsy of life inside stone walls. Before we begin this chilly journey, let's take a quick pause. Subscribe to our channel if you love slow, deep dives into history that skip the clichés. And don't forget to leave a comment telling us where you're listening from and what time it is. We love hearing from you all over the world. A medieval castle wasn't a luxury residence. It was a military installation, built not for comfort, but for control, taxation, intimidation, and survival. Sure, lords lived there, sometimes kings, but that didn't mean life inside was royal in any modern sense. What do we picture when we hear castle? A grand ballroom with silver goblets, lavish feasts and loyal servants lined up in silence, a princess with perfect hair and no knowledge of lice. In reality, a castle was more like a cross between a fortress, prison, army barracks, warehouse, stable, and marketplace, all marinated in mold and fear. And in the middle of it, political games, poisonings, and a lot of manure management, if you were a servant. Here are just a few facts to recalibrate your imagination. Most castles had no real bathrooms. The best-case scenario? A garderobe, a stone protrusion with a hole in the floor which dropped waste down the wall, sometimes onto the kitchen roof. Bon appetit. The temperature indoors was nearly the same as outside. If it was 5 degrees outside, you might get 2 degrees inside. Stone walls kept the cold in. Central heating? Not invented. Fires burned in only 1 or 2 large halls. Bedrooms? Often unheated. Furniture was minimal, literally. Most people slept on straw, often with siblings, and fleas. The Lord got a bed. Everyone else got whatever floor space was left. Noise and stench were constant companions. Dogs ran through the great hall. Geese screamed in the courtyard. Meat hung from ceiling hooks. A maid shouted at a cook, and a creaky stairway sounded like a ghost from Burgundy. Security was an illusion. Many castles had inner towers, not to guard against outsiders, but to protect the lord from his own vassals. Coups, betrayals, family feuds, all part of the daily medieval fun. So no, castles were not amusement parks, not even Game of Thrones. More like a brutal reality show. Survived the stone box without plumbing. This is a story not of glory, but of granite, of smoke that never left your cloak, of ale you drank because the water might kill you, of women giving birth without a doctor, and boys handed a sword at 14 and a gravestone at 16. We're not here to kill the myths, but we will peel back the tapestry, to see the castle not just as a monument to power, but as a machine for controlling people, not a fairy tale, but a chronicle of survival. Ready to step behind the curtain of stone? Then let's begin. Castles didn't appear out of nowhere. They weren't the result of a medieval interior designer waking up one morning and thinking, What if people lived inside a giant stone cannon with towers? No, the castle was the logical, inevitable result of fear, ambition, and geopolitics. Before the towering stone fortresses, there were hills, palisades, and wooden platforms fluttering with flags and nervous watchmen. It all began with fortifications, dating back to the Bronze Age. But the true castle boom came after the fall of Rome, when safety became the most precious currency. One of the earliest medieval castle types was the motte and bailey. Picture a man-made mound, the motte, with a wooden tower on top. Next to it, an enclosed courtyard, the bailey, where servants lived, livestock roamed, and supplies were stored. Take Clifford's Tower in York, England, a well-preserved example of this type. These castles sprang up in the 11th century, particularly after the Norman expansion across Western Europe. They were relatively quick to build, using soil, timber, time, and dozens of peasants with shovels. But there was a problem. Wood burns, and in the Middle Ages, flaming torches were everywhere. Thus came a natural evolution: fight fire with stone. The shift to stone began in earnest during the 12th century, not because medieval lords suddenly discovered architectural aesthetics, but because stone withstood fire and battering rams far better. Projected power. Those who built in stone claimed the land. Was a strategic investment. A castle might take decades to build, but it would last centuries. Early stone keeps, or donjons, were massive, plain, often square. These became the last refuge in a siege. Later, round towers appeared, then curtain walls, moats, barbicans, a full evolution of defensive architecture. Take Rochester Castle in England, one of the oldest surviving stone donjons, built after the Norman conquest. Its thick walls withstood multiple assaults. The castle was never just a home. It was a statement. I rule this land. So they were placed on hills near vital crossings, along trade routes, always close to water, because without it, a siege ends in a week. Consider Crac des Chevaliers in Syria, a crusader fortress guarding the road to Antioch. Built by the Knights Hospitaller, it endured dozens of attacks. Or Caernarfon Castle in Wales, built by Edward the Firn to stamp English rule into the Welsh landscape. It wasn't just a stronghold, it was propaganda carved in stone. Who built these behemoths? Not kings alone. Castles took years, even decades. They required architects known as masters, masons, carpenters, diggers, peasants invited to help. Refusal wasn't encouraged. Occasionally, prisoners and slaves. Designing a castle was both art and science. Soil, geology, water sources, and wind direction all had to be considered. Even sunlight. It helped if one side of your stone house wasn't permanently freezing. And all of this was done without computers, cranes, or cement. The cost? Astronomical. In 13th century England, an average castle could cost anywhere from $500 to $10,000. Millions in today's terms. Caernarfon Castle alone cost over $25,000, the budget of a small duchy. Some French lords bankrupted entire villages across generations just to lay the stones. But it was worth it. A castle was a fortress, a court, a treasury, and a prison in one. In rare cases, architecture became ideology. Neuschwanstein Castle in Bavaria, built in the 19th century by Ludwig II, was more theater than fortress. Ironically, the most castle-like castle in history never saw a siege, but it did inspire Disneyland. Or Pierrefonds in France, restored in the 1800s by Viollet-le-Duc as a Gothic fantasy, more dream than defense. So why did castles become so central? Because centralized power didn't exist. Monarchs were weak, armies small, roads dangerous. The castle became a tool for ruling the local world, a means of taxing, watching, defending, a refuge in chaos. Whoever held the castle held everything that lay beneath its shadow. The origins of the castle are not about beauty, but about necessity, fear, and power. They evolved from dirt mounds into stone monoliths, from defensive huts to towers that cast judgment over entire regions. Next, we step inside. How were these giants actually built? What lay within their walls? What happened behind their gates? If God is in the heavens, then the Lord must be above, looking down on all of you. A castle was never just a building. It was concentrated power, crystallized in geometry, fear organized into towers, a technology of domination expressed in stone, and it was built not only with shovels and stone, but with an entire world view. Let's imagine the 12th century. Territories are expanding, lands must be controlled. A lord or a king decides, we need a castle, not a palace, not a manor, a castle, a place that could withstand siege, house a garrison, and project status. The first step wasn't a shovel, but a pen. A master architect, often with experience building cathedrals or city walls, would draw the plans. All calculations were made by eye, guided by tradition, experience, and intuition. Engineers had to choose the site carefully: elevation, visibility, access to water, proximity to resources. Would the soil support the weight of the keep? Would the wind batter the gates? Could the rising sun warm at least one wall? Stone was the primary building material, but not just any stone. Builders used what the region offered: limestone, sandstone, granite. Lime mortar was used to bind the stones. It would harden over centuries. Wood was for bridges and ceilings, iron for hinges, gates, and locks, lead for sealing rooftops. In Caernarfon Castle, builders used two types of colored stone to evoke Roman Byzantine imperial aesthetics, a kind of medieval architectural marketing aimed at the subdued Welsh population. A typical stone castle had several key elements: the keep, the main tower, final refuge, and lord's residence, with walls up to 4 meters thick; the curtain wall, the outer defensive wall with battlements and walkways; towers, placed at intervals, usually round for better impact resistance; the barbican, a fortified outpost or gatehouse before the main entrance; the moat, dry or filled with water, not for crocodiles, but to delay attackers; the drawbridge, operated by chains, could be raised or lowered in minutes; the great hall, for receptions, feasts, and justice; the chapel, kitchens, stables, armories, and storerooms, everything for a self-contained world. A castle was not a home. It was a functioning ecosystem, designed to survive weeks or months under siege. Building such a structure required an entire industry, hundreds of people, dozens of professions. Master masons, the most valued workers, sometimes left their initials in stone. Carpenters, blacksmiths, kiln makers, oxen, horses, and often human labor for transport. Peasants, conscripted for forced labor, corvée. Cooks, tailors, and servants to keep the site running. Construction took place during the warmer months. In winter, mortar wouldn't set, tools broke, and progress halted. Work was gradual. First, the perimeter was built, outer walls to establish a secure zone. Then came the keep, the most fortified part. Next, inner structures like halls, storage, chapels. Finally, decorative touches, coats of arms, windows, stained glass, lifting stones, yes, with giant treadwheel cranes, human-powered wheels in which men walked like hamsters to hoist massive blocks. Average construction time ranged from 5 to 20 years. Caernarfon Castle took 47. Crac des Chevaliers was built in phases over a century. It was a mega project, a regional economy, a lord's largest expense. If war loomed, the castle fund was emptied first. And it wasn't just engineering, it was symbolism. Windows placed high. The lord looks down. Coats of arms above the gate, authority on display. Towers not just for defense, but for power's visibility. Chapels. Alliance with God built into the structure. At Château de Bonaguil in France, the entrance to the keep was designed to resemble heavenly gates. The message was clear. Approaching the Lord was like approaching divinity. As time passed, castles adapted. Gunpowder meant lower, thicker walls and angled bastions. Later castles had comfort features, chimneys, bigger windows, private rooms. Some evolved into palaces, like the Loire Valley Chateau in France. But the essence remained. A castle was a physical manifesto of authority, wrapped in paranoid design. Castles were never built for coziness. They were machines of defense and control. They kept enemies out and peasants in line. Each stone, each tower declared, "This is not your home. This is the center of the world, and you are out there." Next, we step inside. Who lived within? What did it mean to be a lord in such a place? What fears did they wall off with stone? If the castle is a machine of power, the lord is both its pilot and its prisoner. Being at the top of the feudal pyramid didn't mean enjoying luxury. It meant living with constant anxiety. Enemies outside, traitors within, bishops demanding tithes, kings calling for war, wives giving birth in cold rooms, and heirs born with questionable legitimacy. All of this behind stone walls that barely held heat. The term lord was broad. It could mean a baron, an earl, a duke, a vassal of the king, or even a politically active archbishop. All of them held feudal rights to collect taxes, administer justice, command troops. But the castle was not just a seat of power. It was a home, and like all homes, it began with daily life. The lord lived in the keep, the main tower of the castle. There, one would find a private chamber, a reception hall, a chapel, and a storage room. But a private chamber wasn't a bedroom in the modern sense. It was a large, cold space, often without partitions, with a straw-covered floor. The lord slept in a canopy bed, not for decoration, but to block drafts, insects, and rats. He covered himself in furs. Bathing was rare and a special occasion, not a habit. Toilets? A stone niche with a hole in the floor leading straight outside. The garderobe? King Edward I of England reportedly had special toilets constructed with wooden lids and ventilating windows, a luxury only the powerful could afford. Food was rich, but not necessarily healthy. The staples were meat, game, pork, beef, fish, and bread, often heavily spiced to mask spoilage. Vegetables were considered peasant food. Beer and mead were the drinks of choice. Water was unsafe unless boiled. Feasts were political events where alliances were forged. But even during celebrations, the great halls were cold, dark, and noisy. Records from Warwick Castle show that a single banquet could consume up to 400 liters of ale and several dozen pigs. A Lord's Day was structured, morning prayers in the chapel, followed by breakfast, bread, meat, beer. Then meetings with vassals, handling disputes, issuing orders. Judicial hearings came next. The Lord often acted as judge. Midday brought the main meal, then hunting, both recreation and military training. Evenings included services and family dinner. All this unfolded under the constant threat of attack, treason, or royal inspection. Lords were not isolated rulers. They were nodes in a feudal network. Their marriages, offspring, and correspondence were all political instruments. Marriage was about land, not love. Children were heirs and hostages in strategic alliances. Letters were essential. Some lords wrote dozens each week. Lady Mary de Burgh of Ireland, for example, wrote over 200 letters a year in the 1320s, filled with requests, complaints, and negotiations. Power came with risk. Poison, betrayal by vassals, accusations of treason, or simply being forgotten by the king's chancellors. These were everyday threats. Roger Mortimer, once a trusted advisor to Queen Isabella, was later accused of treason and hanged in 1330. His castle at Wigmore stood witness to his rapid rise and even faster fall. Castles had their own chapels, priests, sometimes even monks. A lord had to demonstrate piety, not always out of faith, but to maintain political legitimacy. That meant donations to monasteries, attending services, pledging to crusades, even if he didn't go, and founding chapels within his own castle. But the same lord who funded a chapel might also plot assassinations or father illegitimate children. The medieval noble was a mix of saint and predator, and the balance was fragile. Living at the top of a castle meant constantly balancing on the edge. You had everything, and yet controlled very little. Your home could become a prison, your fortress a trap, your power the spark for the next rebellion. Next, we'll descend the stone stairs and enter the world of those who cooked, cleaned, stoked the fires, and never sat at the high table. If castles could talk, they'd cough, in the voices of those who cleaned them. When we imagine a medieval castle, our eyes instinctively rise toward the towers, thrones, and tapestries. But real life pulsed below, literally, in basements, kitchens, storerooms, and corridors, in hands that chopped wood, kneaded dough, stoked fires, emptied chamber pots, and rose before sunrise. Without those hands, a castle would have been a cold monument to silence. The social map of the castle was strictly vertical. At the top, the lord and his family. Below them, vassals, chaplains, knights, stewards. Further down, the servants. Even among the servants, there was a hierarchy. The steward oversaw the entire domestic economy. The seneschal handled internal order and events. Under them, the head cook, brewer, armorer, chamberlain. Below them, laundry maids, scullions, stable hands, pages, fire starters, night cleaners, scribes. It was a living organism. Each role was part of a system keeping the stone shell alive. Life as a servant wasn't glamorous, but it could be stable. Endless work, meager meals, a rigid routine, balanced by a roof over your head and a chance to survive. Servants slept on straw mats and shared rooms. They ate scraps from the Lord's table, or basic soups of grain and vegetables. Clothes were made from coarse wool, often patched. Winter was harsh and heating rare. Washing was infrequent. The water was cold. Soap expensive. Parasites and skin diseases were common. In some 14th century French castles, servants were inspected for lice and fleas, before being allowed near food or children's quarters. The kitchen was the most active place in the castle. It could employ 10 to 30 people: cooks, bakers, butchers, dishwashers, kitchen boys. Food was prepared on open fires, in kettles and ovens. Fires were lit at dawn by dedicated staff. Water was hauled by bucket from wells or rivers. Meat was preserved with salt, smoke, or vinegar. Dishes were cleaned with sand and ash. Soap? Rare luxury. The cook wielded great power. A spoiled stew could ruin a banquet. A poisoned dish could kill a rival. Some lords kept personal food tasters. Beyond the kitchen lay a whole world. The brewery brewed weak ale for daily drinking. The laundry, rarely used, relied on lye, ash, and occasionally urine for stain removal. Workshops housed tailors, cobblers, smiths, and carpenters, without whom there'd be no shoes, no armor, and no trousers on the lord. Children also worked. Boys from minor noble families began service as pages around age 7 or 8. They carried messages, assisted knights, handled weapons, and learned manners. Girls served noble women, helping with dress, embroidery, and child care. A page could rise to become a squire by age 14, and perhaps a knight. But many never reached that far, falling victim to disease, accidents, or a lord's disfavor. Life for a servant was shaped by fear. Punishments were harsh: flogging for theft, exile for rudeness. Intrigue was constant. Servants could be framed, used as scapegoats, or caught in palace politics. In siege, they were often the first to starve or die. But there were rare rewards. A loyal servant could rise to become a steward, receive land, or earn payment. A few even became vassals. One such case, Richard Le Suard, a servant who rose through the ranks to become a vassal under King Henry III, rewarded with land for his service, the elegance of castle life, the tapestries, feasts, hunts, rested on anonymous labor. These people left no memoirs. Their names survive only in account books and burial records. But without them, no one would light the Lord's hearth, lift the drawbridge in time, fetch his wine, or scrub the garderobe clean. This was a class that didn't fight for power. It fought for warmth and leftovers, and in doing so, it kept the castle alive. The castle wasn't built only on stone, but on the backs of those who served it. They didn't write history, but without them, history would have frozen in its halls. Next, we turn to the one thing that brought lords and servants, knights and cooks, close together: food. When we think of medieval castles, we often picture grand feasts, tables overflowing with roasted meat, silver gleaming, and people eating with the enthusiasm of someone just returned from the Crusades. And sometimes they had. But the truth of castle dining was far more complex. A world where food intersected with religion, rank, and survival. In a medieval castle, food served many purposes. It was fuel for physically demanding life. It was a marker of social status. The rarer or spicier the dish, the higher the prestige. It was a political instrument. Alliances were sealed over shared meals, and it was bound by religion. Fasting dictated what could be eaten and when. For instance, on Fridays, even a hungry lord was expected to forego meat, no matter how tempting the roasting boar smelled. Instead, fish would be served, if available, or a fish pie made of celery and herbs to bend the rules creatively. Typical castle fare included pork, beef, venison, rabbit, and poultry. Fish like cod, eel, and herring, often salted or smoked. Bread made of rye or wheat, depending on wealth. Porridges from barley, wheat, oats, cheeses, eggs, nuts, honey. Vegetables, though considered peasant food, might sneak into stews. Fruits, dried or fresh depending on the season. Spices, black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, were expensive and used to flaunt affluence. Food was cooked over open hearths using iron pots and spits. Roasted meat was the most elite form. It required time, firewood, and staff. Stews were more economical, often consumed by servants. Pies were practical. They hid leftovers. Soups were thick and hearty. Preserving food was crucial. With no refrigeration, meat and fish were salted, smoked, or soaked in vinegar. Grain and dried goods were stored in large cellars. Records from Alnwick Castle show they kept over 2,000 salted herring, 400 eels, and 300 barrels of ale in a single year, enough to survive a siege or impress guests. Water was mistrusted, rightly so, as it often carried disease. Instead, people drank ale, light and low alcohol, even for children, mead, sweeter and stronger, imported wine, expensive, and herbal infusions, chamomile, sage, thyme. Alcohol was cultural. Getting drunk wasn't shameful, it was expected. In Conwy Castle, cooks were officially allotted 4 mugs of ale per day. That was the baseline. Banquets weren't just meal, they were institutions. A performance. Dozens of guests attended. Meals were served in multiple courses, from fruit and pies to soups, roasted meats and desserts. Music accompanied the meal, lutes, harps, singing. Jugglers, trained animals, and dwarfs might provide entertainment. Servants moved silently, towels in hand. Humor and satire were part of the experience. All this opulence stood on the backdrop of hunger in the villages, disease in the servants' quarters, and smoke in the kitchens. The banquet was a mask, held up by invisible labor. Fasting was no joke. The church mandated up to 150 days per year without meat, milk, or eggs. Fish was allowed, even eels from muddy ditches. Meals were adapted. Plant oils replaced butter, almond milk stood in for dairy, and some dishes imitated meat to fool the tongue but not the soul. In one famous 14th century case, a Parisian archbishop decreed that eels were not fish, but serpent-like creatures, therefore exempt from fasting rules. Let's not forget the side effects. Castle cuisine was fatty, spicy, and heavy on beer. The result? Bloating, belching, and flatulence were everyday realities. No medicine, no shame. In fact, burping was considered a compliment to the cook. Passing gas wasn't welcomed, but neither was holding it in. These aren't the parts you'll find in Arthurian romance, but medieval medical texts confirm it. In the castle, food wasn't just sustenance, it was where body, God, and politics collided. Power simmered in stews. Alliances were forged at the table. Even spice levels were statements of hierarchy. Next, we'll tackle the least appetizing chapter of all. The bedrooms, the bathrooms, and everything that made castle life physically uncomfortable. Where there were no toilets, there were legends about the smell. If you've ever spent a night in an old castle, you might have noticed that scent. A mix of damp, mold, stone, and silence. Now imagine adding to that the smell of human waste, unwashed bodies, wet fur, ash, wine, and garlic. And all of it, constantly. The medieval castle wasn't just a seat of power. It was a place where hygiene was a compromise between survival and the desire not to choke. The medieval bathroom was the garderobe, a protruding stone alcove with a hole in the floor. Everything fell straight down the outer wall. Best case scenario, into a moat. Worst case, right where people walked or where food was stored. Toilet paper? None. People used rags, moss, straw, or, in some cases, someone else's hand. The smell? Ever present, especially in summer. Garderobes were shared, often without doors. Heated toilets existed, but only in the richest castles. Dover Castle had one of the most advanced garderobe systems, with a vertical water channel to flush waste downward. A primitive ancestor of plumbing, 3 meters deep. Castle bedrooms weren't cozy chambers. They were survival caves. People slept on straw mattresses or canopy beds, designed not for beauty, but to block drafts, insects, and rats. Bedding was filled with straw, hay, or wool. Sheets were rare and washed monthly, if that. People slept fully clothed, even in fur and hats. Fires were rarely lit in bedrooms. Wood was expensive. In Caernarfon Castle, the lord's private quarters could drop to 4 or 6 degrees Lahast in winter, and that was considered luxurious. Fleas, lice, and mites were constant roommates. People shaved their heads or wore caps to hide the issue. Everyone owned a louse comb, a perfectly normal accessory. Clothes weren't washed often. Occasionally, rooms were fumigated, smoked with herbs or sulfur. English traveler John Mandeville once described a French castle where the smell of lavender was overpowered by the stench of roasted beetles, a side effect of fumigation. Bathing, an event, not a habit. Baths were wooden tubs lined with cloth. Water was heated in pots. Lords enjoyed herbal baths with rosemary, sage, or rose petals. Servants bathed in cold water with ash. Soap was rare. The poor used lye or sulfur wash. Some castles had designated bath attendants who would scrub the lord's body with a cloth. In France, these attendants were subject to hygiene laws. They were forbidden from having skin diseases. Privacy? Nearly non-existent. Rooms were shared, doors uncommon. A lord might have a private chamber, but servants, scribes, or children often slept nearby. Intimacy happened behind a screen, under a blanket, by candlelight, or no light at all. Marriages weren't about love, but children were the political proof of success. A record from Beaumaris Castle mentions a page who tried not to breathe or look as the lord and lady settled into bed a few feet from his own mat on the floor. Childbirth and death were part of domestic life. Birth took place in the bedroom with a midwife, not a doctor. If complications arose, survival was uncertain. Medicine meant herbs, prayers, or charms. Death was familiar: infection, epidemics, wounds, food poisoning. In 1316, 5 guests and a cook died after a feast at Warwick Castle, suspected poisoning, likely spoiled venison. The castle had no bathroom and no mercy for weakness. Between coats of arms and banquet halls, another world existed: dampness, lice, despair, and stench. Castle life wasn't about comfort, it was about surviving in spite of the conditions. Next, we open the arrow slits. We face siege. What happened when death stood at the gate? A castle is a fortress until hunger sets in. A medieval castle may look impenetrable. Thick walls, towers, moats, iron gates. Everything says, "You shall not pass." But any castle is not just a place of protection. It's a test. Because, in truth, a fortress is also a stone-lined trap, especially when the enemy is at your gate and the food is running out. A siege wasn't a battle. It was a waiting game. An army would arrive and simply stay. They'd surround the fortress, cut off supply lines, burn crops, and launch barrages from ballista and trebuchets. Inside the walls, the castle's residents, the garrison, servants, the lord's family, and fleeing villagers. A siege could last days, months, even years. The siege of Carlisle Castle in 1315 lasted over 6 months, ending only when dysentery broke out among the attackers. Castle defense relied on multiple layers, outer walls, tall and thick with parapets and walkways, barbicans, fortified gatehouses ahead of the main entrance, arrow slits, narrow openings for archers, drawbridges raised when under threat, machines, ballistae, boiling oil, stone-dropping traps. Inside, defenders needed a water source, granaries, salted provisions, fireproof architecture, sand barrels to douse flames. At Crac des Chevaliers, secret inner corridors allowed defenders to maneuver even during partial enemy occupation. Life under siege was less life, more survival. They ate stored grain, salted meat, dried fish, drank water from wells, beer, herbal infusions, measured every portion, slept in armor or with it beside them, put out fires, patched walls, took night shifts. As supplies ran low, they turned to bone broth, then boiled leather belts, then nothing. During the 1215 siege of Rochester Castle, defenders reportedly boiled and ate leather straps. Some survived. Attackers tried everything: mining, digging tunnels under walls to collapse them, battering rams, smashing gates, trebuchets, hurling stones, rotting corpses, waste, diseased animals, fire to burn gates and roof beams, psychological warfare, dumping bodies, blasting horns, shouting threats. In 1304, during the siege of Stirling Castle, the English deployed a massive trebuchet nicknamed Behemoth, launching 140-kilogram stones. The castle fell. Fear was constant. Panic could spread fast. Betrayal was a real threat. Sometimes a servant opened the gates. Disease followed. Dysentery, cholera, typhus. Many sieges ended not in storming the walls, but in diplomacy, treachery, or starvation. Surviving a siege wasn't the same as winning. The castle was left a ruin, a graveyard, a haunted monument. It had to be rebuilt, sanitized, and the dead buried. The Lord had to reassert his rule. In the 1370s, Château de Châtellerault in France was abandoned after a siege, replaced by a wooden citadel, because the stone one was too traumatizing for locals. A castle wasn't just a house with towers. It was a theater of war, where stone fought hunger and willpower stood against fear. During siege, every meter of wall became a prayer for survival, sometimes answered, sometimes crushed. Next, we'll leave the battlefield and enter the invisible world that filled the castle as much as smoke or steel, faith, fear, and the supernatural. Medieval people didn't just believe in God. They lived in a constant atmosphere of the supernatural. In castles, this was everywhere. In chapels, prayers, amulets, forbidden rooms, and even in corridor layouts, designed so that evil spirits would get confused and lose their way. A castle was never just populated by people. Spirits, angels, demons, saints, and fear dwelled there, peeking from the towers, the well, and even from dreams. Every castle had a chapel, large or small. It served as a place for daily prayer, for rites like baptisms, marriages, and burials, and as a visible declaration of the Lord's piety. Lords were expected to show their devotion to the church, to fund chapels, hire priests, and make donations. Servants had prayer times too, though they often prayed in corridors, kitchens, or on the move. In Warwick Castle, records mention night services, specifically for servants who were too busy to attend during the day. Prayer infused daily life. Each day began and ended with Ave Maria, Meals started with blessings. In difficult times, people held extra services, made vows, and kept fasts. During sieges, monks were summoned for emergency prayers. Icons or crucifixes might be found in every room. Religion wasn't a part of life. It was the structure that held it together. But faith was never alone. Superstition walked right beside it. Dead animals were buried in castle walls to ward off evil spirits. Amulets were worn. Animal teeth, bits of holy soil, tiny crosses. Before battle, some lords recited magical psalms, banned by the church but widely practiced. People believed in house spirits, castle ghosts, fiery riders, and women who sucked the strength out of men. At the French castle of Tonnerre, a lord had the cellar sealed because, according to the staff, a woman in white could be heard whispering prayers behind people's backs. Castles often had chaplains, private priests for the lord. They led mass, heard confessions, managed correspondence, and even handled diplomacy. Some castles housed temporary cloisters for visiting monks. These clergy were mediators between Lord and God, and sometimes between Lord and political power. Fear of the unclean was serious. Bodies weren't buried within the castle walls. It was believed souls couldn't rest. If someone died violently, rooms were sprinkled with holy water. A light was kept burning in tower windows to repel the shadow. Dreams were taken seriously. Water, fire, or horses were signs of misfortune. In Conwy Castle, a shadow banishment ritual was recorded. A straw effigy burned while Psalm 91 was read aloud. Castle women sometimes knew herbs, charms, even love spells. Herbalists and midwives were semi-magical figures. Lords consulted wise women in secret, then prayed they wouldn't be accused of heresy. The line between religion, folklore, and magic was thin, and no one wanted to find out which side they were on. A castle was not only a fortress of stone, but a tower of prayer, fear, and hope. In its chapels, psalms were whispered. In its cellars, shadows were feared. On the stairs, amulets were hidden. In every corner, someone called on God or chased away the devil. Next comes our final chapter. We'll see how castles lost their military power, became ruins, museums, symbols, and why they still linger in our imagination. The medieval castle was built for war, but once war changed, it became obsolete. What was once a bastion of power became a picturesque ruin. And later, something more, a symbol, a myth, a tourist attraction, a cover image of historical imagination. This chapter is about how stone became memory, and memory a style. Gunpowder ended the Stone Age of castles. With the arrival of cannons and firearms in the 14th, 15th centuries, tall walls became a weakness, easily shattered by explosive force. Garrisons became mobile. Armies no longer lived in castles. The cost of maintaining these fortresses became economically absurd. In France, following the 16th century wars of religion, hundreds of castles were deliberately destroyed to prevent them from becoming rebel strongholds. By the 17th, 18th centuries, castles had lost their military function, but hadn't yet gained romantic appeal. Many were dismantled for building stone, abandoned, sometimes used by squatters or smugglers, forgotten until their silhouette began to look epic. Tintagel Castle in Cornwall became a popular destination only in the 19th century, though a century earlier it was dismissed as a hazardous pile of rocks. The 19th century saw a transformation, the castle as poetry, not weapon, Writers like Sir Walter Scott and Victor Hugo, romantic painters and composers, all idealized the medieval world. Castles became symbols of lost time, knightly honor, tragedy, and love. Restoration projects emerged, like Eugène Viollet-le-Duc in France or King Ludwig II's dream castles in Bavaria. Ludwig's Neuschwanstein was never built to resist an army, but to fulfill a theatrical fantasy. And it worked. He sparked the trend of the castle as an art form. In the 20th century, castles became museums. They were woven into national stories, transformed into wedding venues, film sets, photo ops, and reenactment stages. Some were rebuilt from ruins or invented entirely, like theme park castles and castle-style hotels. Island Donan Castle in Scotland, demolished in the 18th century, was fully reconstructed in the 1930s and is now widely considered authentic. Even ruins have power. A castle is an archetype, towers, walls, battlements, all wired into our idea of strength, a metaphor for solitude, despair, safety, and romance, a stage for projection, from Disney to Game of Thrones. The Middle Ages are gone, but the castle remains, because it gives the sense of solid ground in a soft world. Today, castles no longer protect against armies, but they protect us from forgetting. They were never kind, never comfortable, but they were witnesses to all we still try to understand: fear, power, faith, survival. Even now, when we glimpse a tower through fog, we don't think of catapults. We think, what happened there in the dark? And why does it still haunt us? This journey through castle halls, dungeons, garderobes, and battlements has come to an end. But history never truly ends. Tell us in the comments what era, topic, or place you'd like us to explore next. Shall we peek behind the curtains of Byzantium? Step into the imperial palaces of China? Or descend into the dungeons of the Inquisition? Subscribe to the channel if you enjoy slow, deep stories. And let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. We truly love seeing the map light up. Until we meet again, somewhere in the past.